Let me again welcome you to NINAS, which is the Nigeria Indigenous Nationalities Alliance for Self-Determination. What is self-determination? Self-determination is a right of the ethnic nations. It's a right to determine how they are governed. It's a right to determine how they relate to other states. It's a right to their assets. It's the right to protect their people, to provide security for their people, benefits for their people. It's a right to be a nation. And that's what NINAS is going for. The rejection or repudiation of that 1999 Constitution. I know Donald is going to look at me with a little bit of puzzlement when I ask him to please give us just a little bit of history. Because it's important for us to know where we have been, especially who we are. What are we today? Or what are we being told we are today in this one Nigeria situation? And quickly also, what has NINAS done to get us ready to take back our sovereignty or our nationhood? So Donald, if you can pick that up, that would be great. And I do see that Gogo has joined us. I see that Dafo has joined us. And welcome, both of you. You are going to be part of the presentation, and I am going to make you host. While, Donald, if you could please give us a little bit of who we really are and what NINAS has done to set us up to be successful in this freedom process. Thank you, Donald.
Very much, and welcome all. Thank you, Jane. Yeah, it's always good to know that when we talk about NINAS today, the journey for self-determination did not just start today. Our journey has started back in shortly after the transition into the democratic government of Olusegun Obasanjo. Because most of the people, for the first time, actually saw the 1999 Constitution after the president was sworn in, because nobody had seen it, nobody had reviewed it, nobody had the opportunity to. It wasn't ratified by or distilled by plebiscites or referendums, so it just came up. But a few people looked at it after it was made public, and they saw all the flaws, and saw most of the things we're seeing today: the enslavement, the lies that we are seeing today, and decided that this was not what we needed to have, as this was not a document that would be perfect for to be the foundational unit of the union that we should all belong to, and immediately swung into action. The president was. President Obasanjo was approached, things were shown to him, and he initially had accepted it, but suddenly he got the government people to, you know what the government does, they got some people appointed that were not elected by the people to come into what he called the Sovereign National Conference. And that's what gave birth to what we all know as the NADECO. So NADECO has been the journey of NINAS. It's all started with the NADECO. From NADECO, after the creation of the establishment of the Sharia in the northern states, what we call the Sharia belts, it was necessary that for those people that seek to recover a sovereignty, to kind of alienate the Sharia belt, because it was unanimously agreed that democracy, the kind of democracy we wanted, could not work hand in hand with the Sharia form of government. So then there was a need to bring up the birth of the movement for New Nigeria, what we call the MNN, or actually the movement for No Nigeria. The Sharia form. The movement for No Nigeria had given there was a mandate by the MNN regional blocks to go and publicly repudiate this 1999 constitution and reject it as the basis of our union. And it started by the Lower Niger Congress, that is the South and the Southeast, having their solemn assembly in Port Harcourt in April 18, 2015. Then followed by the Yoruba Nation, that also had their solemn assembly at Ibadan in 2018. Then followed by the Middle Belts Assembly that had theirs in 2019. And after that, everybody went back to what they call the Lagos Declaration, where it was jointly agreed by all these indigenous blocks that the 1999 Constitution was an illegal document. And given that, having agreed on that, it was agreed that the 1999 Constitution could not be accepted and was publicly rejected by the peoples of the different blocks. So different mandates were also given, like international reach by each of these blocks. There was also mandates to also midwife the process of declaring the seeking self-determination, based on the general acceptance by all these blocks. So I may not have to go into, because I have a very short time. Then in 2019, after all these blocks had completed their mandates, it was now necessary to set up a vehicle to actually drive the entire alliance to self-determination. That was when the Nigerian Indigenous Nationalities Alliance for Self-Determination as a vehicle was created in 2020. And its first mandate is what it did in January 16, 2020, when it declared a constitutional force majeure and also expressed constitutional grievances and sovereignty disputes. And by way of this proclamation, had demanded that the government action 5 demands. And the first demand was that the government, the federal government, should acknowledge the fact that there are constitutional grievances based on the 1999 Constitution, and sovereignty disputes based on the 1999 Constitution, and that the government should also acknowledge the fact that the constitutional force majeure has been declared. It also went forth to say that the government, having acknowledged this, should jettison the 1999 Constitution as the basis of the Union, and by this, suspend all national elections being conducted under these elections until all these grievances are resolved. Also demanded that the government should invite the indigenous people to work with it, where the indigenous people will guide it and come up with a timeline to transit from this fraudulent constitution to the people's constitution. It said that the government should do this in 2 stages. The first stage is that the federal government should set the regional blocks to go back to their regions and conduct and have come up with the people's constitution that will be ratified and distilled by plebiscites and referendum. And based on the results of this referendum, given being the second stage, these regional indigenous nationalities can now go back to the center to renegotiate its federating terms. What NINAS is actually doing is that it wants the indigenous people to get back, to recover their sovereignty. And when they recover their sovereignty based on a referendum, they can now determine how they want to renegotiate its terms, how they want to bind back itself. If necessary, it depends on what the people want. The people decide they do not want to continue. They want to have their union on their own. They want to have an independent union. They want to have a confederation or a proper federation. Or they could as well want to come back and say, let us renegotiate how I'm going to be part of this union. So that is the process where NINAS is. And at this point, because the federal government has refused most of these demands, NINAS is at the process of activating the people's power, that is orienting the people to understand that this is the only way forward for us to gain our sovereignty. Thank you very much, Gina. I yield here for you to take over from there.
Okay, thank you very much, Donald, for that information. That was really well spoken. I mean, this is something that we all need to clearly key into as to what's actually going on in our country. We have to know who we are. We have to know that we were nations. We have to know that when we're talking about one Nigeria, they're not really talking about the agreed upon Nigeria, because what we have is not one Nigeria. What we have is unitary Nigeria, which is very different from one Nigeria. One Nigeria was a situation, as Donald said, where we had regions. Those regions were nations. And those nations came together to agree upon working together. They would be independent nations that were self-governing and autonomous. Okay? Now, do you see any self-governance or autonomy in any of the situation that we have in Nigeria? No, we don't. That is not what we have in place. What we have is everything that has been collapsed into what's called the indivisible, indissoluble. And anytime anyone says that to you, just say this to him: where is the referendum? Just that simple question should put them in their place. So now I am going to have Donald to introduce our next speaker, who is going to be talking about all this money in Nigeria from revenue from oil. And have you seen the loans that has been taken since Buhari has come into office? Where is that money going? Why do we have 90 million in poverty with all that money? So Donald, if you can please introduce him, that would be wonderful. And then when we come back, and after he's done, Gogo will be taken over to moderate for us. So Donald, you can introduce him, please. So Donald, if you can please. Donald, you need to unmute.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Tapo Sawa, are you around? Can you come up back? I was going to talk to us about, he's an economist. And so he's going to be telling us about, we all know that the Nigerian government recently have been taking so much loans. At the same time, we also know that Nigeria is the poverty capital of the world. So that will be telling us where this money is going to. And he will just be telling us everything about the economics and where the failures are. Akbo, are you there? Okay, see, I can see screen.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're dialing in from. It's amazing that we get to look at our numbers, because most times it's in the numbers that you really get to understand what is really going on, especially with Nigeria. And I think the best way to start is to look at what we call what are the dreams of our founding fathers. What did Nigeria used to be in the 1950s before we started to have a situation where the entire productivity of the country, the entire plan basically has been hijacked, and it's currently going upside down. Very common knowledge that we are the poverty capital, one of the poorest countries. I always talk about poverty in the sense that for you to understand the problem of poverty, we have a situation whereby about 90 million people, more than 50% of our population live on less than 1,000 naira a day. And these people are classified as they are living under absolute or abject poverty. So it's a very big problem if you look at it from that regard. And it's 6 million, it's a huge population if you compare with some of the other populations in other countries, right? And even if you compare that particular problem, if you look at it in terms of states, you start to understand it that in the southern part of Nigeria, the poverty, for example, in the southwest, the poverty levels is about 20%. And then if you look at things, take it to the north northeast, northwest, the poverty level is about 80%. So it tells you a very big problem that we have in the country. But what sits even more is that I always ask people that what was the dream of our founding fathers? In the 1950s, Nigeria controlled 49% of the world palm kernel production. Nigeria produced 417 metric tons that we have in the country. And ironically, the entire world produced 850,000 metric tons. So Nigeria produced 417,000 metric tons. And those metric tons were produced in the southern part of the country. So palm oil was produced in the southern part of the country. We produced 42% of the world's production. So 350,000 metric tons compared to 840,000 metric tons produced in the world. Now, if you understand palm oil and palm kernel, they essentially followed the industrial revolution of the 17th, 18th century, and even the 19th century. So without palm oil, you couldn't run your machine. So you needed them to run trade. So it was like controlling the world's crude oil production, essentially. And that was what we were doing back in the 1950s. And the situation got, it's if you look at the numbers, you can even look at cocoa beans, for instance. Cocoa beans that was predominantly produced in the southwest, Nigeria we produced 22% of the world's production. And similarly for rubber as well, we produced 24% of the world's production. And without rubber, you couldn't do many things, including manufacturing a lot of byproducts for cars, right? And essentially, if you look at the numbers and you put it side by side, if you see the way we control the world's economy then and you compare it to now, you see that a lot of things have changed. But despite that, in 1959, a lot of the time, people always say that we used to be a very good country. When we had a little bit of our sovereignty in our hands, you could understand why. Nigeria was growing at 8.4% GDP growth year on year in 1959. If you compare that with last year, we had a minus 0.1% or aggregate to 0.1% economic growth. So essentially, we contracted the economy. And if you look at it in terms of the structure, which will give you an idea as to what our founding fathers did correctly and what we have successfully done wrong, it might open your eyes into where the whole thing is failing. So essentially, we have in 1959, capital expenditure, which is the money that is provisioned for construction of railway, roads, infrastructure, power, medicine, free education, which is capital expenditure was classified in the budget, was 58%. So out of 98.9 million budget, 98.9 million pounds budget, 57 million pounds was classified for capital expenditure. If you put that side by side with 2020, we only budgeted 24% of our budget, 2.4 trillion for capital expenditure, which was 24%. Now, if you take that back, recurrent expenditure, which is the money spent servicing salaries, which is the money our founding fathers paid themselves for the job they were doing, they only budgeted 24% of the budget, right? If you put that side by side with 2020, we budgeted 47%. So we essentially spent all that money, 47% of it paying ourselves, and 24% of the money planning for capital expenditure. If you reverse that back into the 1950s, then you can understand the problem. They budgeted as much as 60% of the budget for infrastructure, for capital expenditure. But when it got to our turn to do it correctly, which is the last year, we did it the other way around. We budgeted 47% to pay salaries and 24% for capital infrastructure. So therein lies the problem. And if you compare it side by side with all the other deficiencies, if you take that exact amount and you want to value it, if you do the numbers, you crunch numbers, you factor in inflation, what we have essentially done is that our founding fathers budgeted 52 trillion naira for capital expenditure, and we budgeted 2.4 trillion for capital expenditure. So we have reversed the growth. We've spent 60 years just reversing every single growth they've handed to us. Now, if you take that side by side and you know, just oppose it with all the other problems that we already know we face, and now we are going to look at, I think everybody's aware of the debt, and it's something that it scares everybody when you look at it and you wonder, how did we get here? So let's just talk about debt. And I'm going to use just external debt and domestic debt. And I'm going to take just data so we can see just how quickly we have grown our debt. Let's talk about domestic debt. We had 8.84 trillion That was in 2015. We started with 8.84 trillion when we handed it over to the Buhari administration. And in 2 years, it had grown domestic debt from 8.84 trillion to 12.59 trillion. So he had managed to borrow 4 trillion more in just 2 years, compared to over, I'd say, almost 18 years prior to that. So in just 2 years, he had managed to double our external debt, and that's just in compared to 16 years before. So these are the products of many failures when we talk about failures of the current administration. If you look at how external debt has also risen in 2 years, between 2015 and 2017, they are taking domestic external debt in dollar from $7 billion to $14 billion. So essentially, it took us 16 years to accrue $7 billion worth of debt. And it took Buhari only 2 years to accrue $7 billion worth of debt. So between 2015 and 2017, he raised external debt from $7 billion to $14 billion. By 2020, external debt had grown from $7 billion where he met it to $28 billion, to $28.57 billion. That is the extent to which we have borrowed our way into this country. And if you look at it, the domestic debt as well, where he met at 8.84 trillion, he has managed to double it to 16.02 trillion. So this shows you clearly that we're borrowing more than ever in our history, more than we've ever had to borrow, more than any administration. If you put the aggregate of 8 years of Obasanjo and 2 years of Yar'Adua and 6 years of Jonathan, that's 16 years. In 16 years, they managed to borrow an aggregate debt, including servicing their loan, clearing up the debt at a stage. All they managed to achieve was $7 billion. Buhari has tripled that to $28 billion. If you look at it from the perspective of domestic debt, all the previous 3 presidents managed to borrow was 8.8 trillion naira. Buhari has managed to borrow in his own administration 16 trillion naira. So he has borrowed an additional 8 trillion. So this tells you clearly that we are heading in the wrong direction. We're not servicing our debts. And even last year, I think we generated about 3.34 trillion in revenue. And then we what do they call it? We generated revenue, and we managed to pay debt servicing of 3.34. So it's almost 98% of our revenue went into debt servicing. Now let's look at it in perspective of who is paying for this debt. Because if you understand this, then you can understand why the alliance territory needs to leave as quickly as possible. The first thing we can look at is in 3 different data sets, and we're going to look at the VAT. We're going to look at IGR, it's on another slide, and we're going to look at GDP. So if we look at the VAT very quickly, VAT generated in between January and August 2021, there was a publication that came out that essentially disclosed the VAT generated by this. Now the VAT generated by all the Sharia territory, in total, it's about 51 billion. So it's right here, 51 billion. That's the total VAT generated. The VAT generated by the Alliance territory was 731 billion combined. So that's approximately 93%. So the Sharia territory generated 51 billion. The Alliance territory generated 731 billion. When it was time for federal allocation, the Alliance territory and they got 235 billion. Don't forget that VAT is essentially whatever you make, you get back. So it's not supposed to be something that is buffed up by the federal government. Essentially, the principle of VAT is that whatever you make, you get it back. So the Alliance territory, they generated 731 billion in VAT, and they got 804 billion in VAT, right? Whilst the Sharia territory generated 51 billion in VAT and got 235 billion in VAT. So therein lies the paradox of many failures, where some people are working their hardest, the entire rest of the country, the Alliance territory, only got an additional 73 billion in federal allocation from VAT, right? Whilst the Sharia territory got an extra 184 billion in federal allocation from VAT in comparison to what they had generated. That is just horrendous. There's no way that can continue. But of course, we can think that this is an anomaly. This is just one data set, so VAT. Let us take a better look and look at the IGR from 2020. And then that can tell us a little bit more. IGR generated by the Sharia.
Yeah, we didn't borrow.
Sorry. Can the mod please? I'm getting TechnoSpark Go 20. Thank you very much.
Sorry about that. Go ahead and continue. Please, everyone, mute your lines. Mute your lines. We are live on YouTube, please. So mute your lines and all the avenues as well. So please mute your lines. Thank you. Go ahead.
So in 2020, and this is where the data gets really interesting. I just showed you right now how much, ripping off happened when it came to the VAT. But let us talk about IGR, and there's a slide for that. I hope I can quickly put it on. If not, we'll just look at it from the slides. Yeah. When we look at the IGR, like I said, the Sharia territory generated 150 billion. The Alliance territory generated.
But we are not hearing you again. Hello, Dr.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Is it better?
Yes, I can hear you. We can hear you now.
Excellent. Sorry. Just a second. I'd like to continue projection. Okay, so essentially, yes, I wanted to continue, but I can't get my screen to go live, so I'll just continue. So from the 2020,
we're missing your voice again.
Wow, there's something happening with my network.
Yeah, just keep your voice to where your mic is, and then we can hear you, I'm sure.
Okay, all right. I apologize. Is it any better now?
Yes, it is. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll just run through this real quick.
Take your time. You take your time.
Okay, all right. The Sharia territory now generated 116 billion. The Alliance territory generated 1,190 billion. So to put it in perspective, when it came to IGR, the Alliance territory generated 91% of the IGR for the country, which is internally generated revenue, which is basically state taxes. And the Sharia territory generated 9% of the revenue. When it came to federal allocation, and this is where you start to notice it, the percentages are very helpful. The Alliance territory got 80% of federal allocation, whilst this Sharia territories got 20% of federal allocation. This is a region that only generated 9% of federal allocation. They are getting 20% of federal allocation. They only generated 9% of they're getting 20% of federal allocation. Once the Alliance territory generated 91%.
You need to reposition again.
Okay. Is it better now?
Yes. So wherever you are, don't move from that position.
Okay. All right. So whilst the Alliance territory that generated 91% of federal allocation of internally generated revenue only got 80% of federal allocation. This is a territory that generated 91% of the internally generated revenue. They only got 80% of federal allocation. Whilst the other region, the Sharia territory that generated only 9% of internally generated revenue, state taxes, they got 20% of federal revenue. So these are the paradox of many figures. And if you look at it very closely, the fundamentals that guide revenue sharing formula favors the North critically. This is why you never want that constitution to go down, because they are the greatest beneficiaries of the federal allocation, of everybody's money. They are the greatest beneficiaries, because the principles that guide the revenue sharing completely favor them. Things like population, things like land mass, things like even equality as 40%, it completely favors them. So now we've taken a look at the VAT, we looked at the VAT, we looked at the IGR, we're going to now look at our GDPs. Now, the question people always worry about is when you talk about the alliance territory, always complain that can we cope without this core knot, right? People always say, what about our economy? How is it going to cope? What's the dollar going to look like to the currency in the alliance territory after it organizes? It won't take us from frying pan into fire and things like that. Now, hypothetically, assuming that the alliance territory was a country, so I'm just using that for the purpose of this analysis, and the Sharia territory was another country and they split open, what essentially happened to our GDP is we would go from having an approximately 400 billion economy. So GDP of the core north is 55 billion. Once the GDP of the alliance is 340 billion approximately. So therefore, you would have 14%, you lose 14% of the economy, the core north, and you hold 86% of the economy in the alliance territory. So these are the justifications that makes a very strong sense that if you look at the country as a cluster, there's a particular territory that is a deadweight, and that is the Sharia territory. It's literally a deadweight on the rest of the country. If you're able to break that deadweight and lift it economically, you can now start to build a country that will thrive. And if you look at 340 billion in closing, I want to just show you what 340 billion looks like in comparison to other economies. If you look at 340 billion, which is the GDP of the alliance territory, the alliance territory will be between the 36th and 37th country. So that will essentially make us a 36th country, right? Because Denmark will go up to 35, Nigeria will live somewhere around here. Denmark will go up to 35, and then the alliance territory will come down in between Malaysia and Denmark. And that a very close reality to some of the expectations people have of where we should be. In terms of, if you look at that compared to our GDP per capita, it starts to look a bit better. And it gives us a better opportunity to service the debt, service the loans, and all of that. A lot of these unproductive loans that are being taken by the government, they are being invested in failed electricity projects. We read all recently about Siemens complaining about pulling out of the electricity project that they are taking the loan for. Another classic example is the very unproductive railway that Nigeria is currently constructing from Kano to Niger, another country, investing over $400 million of money from the alliance territory into a region that does not generate anything, and investing $1.9 billion of money from that. More than 80% of this money comes from the alliance territory, and then they are going to cite it in more than 91% comes from the alliance territory, and they are going to cite it in a region that generates 9%. So these are the paradox of many failures, and these are the justifications why we must come together and repeal that fraudulent 1999 constitution and gain back sovereignty for our people. It's not just about the existential threat or the killings, even from an economic perspective. It is the only way for us to move forward. We have a situation whereby we are currently existing on the relics of colonialism. We're existing on the relics of extractive institutions. And if you read a book from Daron Acemoglu, it says Why Nations Fail. It will tell you clearly that if you don't build inclusive institutions, you cannot grow your country. And Nigeria, as is made up, is currently filled with extractive institutions domiciled by feudal elites and oligarchs from a particular region of the country. The only way for us to break the hegemony is for us to rebuild the 99 constitution and break free. And then from there, we can start to build a new constitution through referendum, through plebiscites with the alliance territory for an economy that can work like it did in the 1950s. I yield the mic. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you so much, Steve, for that information that you've provided. By the way, it's Gogo speaking. And just hearing from you just inspires me to be part of the Nina's Freedom Movement. And the reason I support this movement is I believe we can get to a place where we're free and we can get to a position where we're able to manage our own assets as a people. and make sure that we don't have terrorists in our land, which is the major thing. I mean, that's the goal for all of this movement, is to get people free in the end. Sorry, someone's mic is on. I'm getting an interjection. So we're going to have Donald come talk to us about NSAS, which is very interesting, and how...
Okay, Gogo, if you can hold on a second.
Yes.
Can everyone please mute their lines? Everyone, please mute your lines.
I already muted the person. It's
okay, awesome. Thank you.
Gogo, you can carry on. Sorry about that.
Yeah, so NSAS, and he would talk about the impact poverty had on the emergence of this highly charged and effective. Don't hand the mic over to you.
Thank you very much, Gogo. We all saw the movement, the pro-NSAS protest.
Yes, you are.
Okay. We all saw the movement, and so many people might have wondered, all these youths coming out, is it just for the safety? The SARS has always been there.